Hoplite's eyes opened slowly, seeing madness surrounding his position on all sides. Elves danced around him in a strange rhythm, like that of a beating heart. The Maglocks had done their job to keep him standing, but he was not where he had been before. Now he was much further away from the root tables, closer to the center of the tiny valley. How had he been moved? Hoplite had no idea. He re-enabled the suit's sound receptors, resulting in his ears being immediately assaulted with a cacophony of slurred singing and the beats of drums. His breathing quickened, his fight response nearly taking over instantly when he realized that an elf woman had begun climbing up his arm. Hoplite blinked again when she straddled his shoulders, spilling wine from a glass she clutched down his helmet as she let out a yell of triumph. The surrounding elves all cheered as Hoplite turned off his maglocks, nearly stumbling as he began standing on his own power once more. The elf girl squealed as his hands reached up to grab her by the waist, lifting her up into the air before setting her on the ground before him. The elves surrounding them all stopped a moment to stare in awe before shouting for Hoplite to join them in the revelry. The elf girl turned to face him, her face a tint of drunken red. She slowly stumbled toward him, falling into his armor and bracing her hands against his torso. He frowned as she wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her body against his in a most unprofessional manner. "Hey, hero," the woman hiccuped. "How about I take you back to my tree? I'll give you a night you'd never forget." Hoplite placed his hand against her forehead and gently shoved her away from him. She tilted back with a laugh, falling back into the open arms of an elf man who had begun singing as he stood her up once more. Hoplite shook his head and yawned, that feeling of peace still present, but not nearly as overpowering as it had been before. He should find Michael or Lance, but where would they be in this milling mass of shifting bodies? Michael would be easy to pick out. His black tungsteel armor would make him stick out like a sore thumb. Lance, though, there were a lot of elves with black hair like Lance had. In fact, the more he strained to find her, the more he noticed that elves only seemed to have two hair colors, blonde and black. With how many black-haired elves there were dancing about, it would be very hard for him to find her. Then again, Lance was very tall for a woman, and these elven girls seemed to be standard human height. That would narrow it down a fair margin. Now he just needed to find her. Or perhaps he would find Michael first. He sighed as he began gently pushing his way through the crowd. He had to fend off several dozen elves from attempting to draw him into a dance, shoving them away as gently as he was able, as to not accidentally kill them. Somehow this had ended up turning into a game for the elves, several going out of their way to get in his path, or to latch onto him before Hoplite promptly pushed them away. Normally, this would have annoyed him to nearly the point of murder. But the peace, while weaker, still had a hold on him. His stomach grumbled when at one point he passed by a root table, still stacked with plenty of still steaming meats. After a few dozen passes through the area trying to find either Lance or Michael, Hoplite finally caved to his desire. He had seen the elves partake in the food several times to no effect. This food wasn't poisoned in any way. Even if it was, he could not be killed by it. So what was there to worry about? He approached a table, pushing several elves out of the way until he was standing over a massive pile of steaks. Hoplite could barely restrain himself after he removed his helmet, magnetizing it to his hip before grabbing a cut from the table and taking a bite. The meat practically fell apart in his mouth, the juice aiding the steak's descent down his throat. Then Hoplite ate another, and another, and another. The plate had been stacked as high as an elf was tall, but by the time Hoplite was done with it, well, it was gone. With his stomach full, he sighed, grabbing a pitcher of water. He then raised it to his mouth before he began chugging, the surrounding elves cheering Hoplite on as he began downing it. His golden eyes widened when he realized that the taste on his tongue wasn't anything like water. It reminded him of an old grape he had as a trainee. This had to be wine. It tasted... It was... fantastic. The sweet bitterness that flowed down his gullet urged him to drink more, the alien taste being unlike anything he'd experienced before. He couldn't stop himself from finishing the pitcher, slamming it back down to the table with a gasp, as a sudden dizziness suddenly overtook him. Wine was alcoholic, wasn't it? He needed to activate his blood filtration system to get rid of this sudden intoxication. With how quickly a hoplite could metabolize food and drink, the alcohol had nearly immediately gone to his head. It felt good, he realized. Very good. Would it be so bad to keep feeling this way for just a little bit longer? A small smile crept across his face as he stumbled back from the table with a hiccup, his vision doubling as he began meandering through the crowd. Elves latched onto him again, but this time, Hoppa could hardly bring himself to shove them away, instead allowing them to pile onto him as they saw fit. Soon this became a new game to them, and soon Hoppet was dragging 10 clingers with him as he continued to search for... What was he doing? Hoppet then giggled for the first time in centuries, lifting his arms to allow more elves to hang from them as he continued to walk, spinning in circles as he went. Everything turned to a blur after that. Lance was very drunk. She was dimly aware of that fact as she twirled through the crowd madly, following the beat of the drums with each motion. The opening hours of the party had gone as expected, with the sharing of tales for the deceased and the beginnings of drink. Humble beginnings compared to how the mass of bodies in the root bowls sloshed like a liquid to and fro. One could almost believe that the dozens of elves in the bowl really were a sloshing fluid at a distance, with some drops spilling out of and into the container as elves climbed in or out to attend different parties. The noise was near deafening around the Ilum tree. There was no doubt about it. This had to be the biggest death day since the end of the Akandari expansion war. Lance dearly hoped that she wouldn't black out during this. She always woke up in the strangest places afterward, like the pigpen incident 20 years ago. Thankfully, no one had found her before she awoke. Lance would have been made fun of for the rest of her long life for passing out on the mud cuddling with pigs. It wasn't her fault, really. It was the pigs' mistake for being so damned adorable. So what if she practically buried herself in them that night? She shook her head. Lance's thoughts were hardly staying on track anymore. That was one of the great things about being so drunk. She couldn't get hung up on past embarrassments, like the pigpen incident. Wait, now she was thinking in circles. Or was it a triangle? The pigpen had been a triangle, right? No, wait. It had been a rectangle. She bumped into something hard, falling to the dirt with a drunken giggle before looking up to see what she had collided with. Lance's eyes widened a margin when she saw what it was. Hoplite. And he was... No, he couldn't be. Hoplite did not smile. He was physically incapable of it, or at least he was supposed to be. Why were there so many elves holding on to him? Hoplite then finally took notice of her, those golden eyes widening a margin before he shook his head. He then leaned down closer to her, those eyes searching her face for a long moment before he smiled again. He smiled. "Sorry about that, Lance," Hoplite said in a slightly slurring tone. "I think I was looking for you?" Hoppet then began peeling off the elves that held on to him, the clingers all groaning in agitation as he displaced them. When he was finally done, he offered a hand to her, and it was then that Lance remembered that she was still sitting in the dirt. She took the proffered hand, his metal gauntlet entombing her hand as he lifted her from the ground. "I think, Lance hiccuped. I think I was looking for you, too. Got lost. Had to drink to keep hydrated. Liquid," she said smartly. Hoppa gave a slow nod after a moment. "You drank the wine," he said with slow blinks. "I've been commandeering beverages as well." "Pfft," Lance spat. "I can still understand you. You ain't drunk," she continued, in what must have seemed to be stunning articulation. Lance had been told several times that she sounded incredibly intelligent when drunk. Surely Hoplite was impressed by how wise she was. Indeed, he nodded his head, scrunching his brow in apparent confusion, as his underdeveloped sober brain tried to comprehend her words. This simply would not do. He had to be on her level of intox intellect for them to have proper dialogue. Without a word, she tugged on his gauntlet, failing to move him even an inch. Hoplite frowned for a moment before allowing himself to be tugged away toward a root table where several pitchers of wine sat. They came before the table, Lance sweeping away a crowd of elves with offensive slurs and ineffective shoves to make a small pocket in the mass of bodies. When the area was clear, Lance leaned over the table, smelling the different pitchers, until she located the brand she was looking for. A pungent aroma, like sweet-boiled honey, with a deep crimson color that was red one second, black the next. This was definitely the one. Dragon's blood wine. Not an actual dragon's blood, of course, but, well, strong enough to ascend any man, no matter how big his liver was, to drunken godhood. She lifted the whole pitcher, proffering it to Hoplite with fire in her green eyes. He looked down at it, quirking a brow before taking it from her. In his hands, it looked almost like a normal cup, as opposed to an entire pitcher of wine. He would just take a few sips and be done with it. No one, not even someone of Hoplite's great size, should be able to withstand drinking more than a few mouthfuls of dragon's blood. A single cup was enough to get even a dwarf drunk. Hoplite looked down to the pitcher, then back up to Lance. She offered her best grin as motivation, or maybe reassurance. Lance could not really tell. Hoplite blinked again, shrugged, and then proceeded to down the whole thing in one go. Lance stared, mystified by what Hoplite was doing. He didn't even sputter when the wine hit his tongue. The power of the dragon blood not enough to stop Hoplite from attempting to down the whole pitcher. The surrounding elves all stared, jaws agape as he finished the entire thing, stumbling over to the table and setting the empty jug atop it. A loud belch emanated from Hoplite, and then Lance heard a strange noise from him. She approached, concerned as that strange low growl slowly grew louder. Was he getting angry? Was he an angry drunk? That was the worst possible outcome. If he was that way, then... A loud laugh then boomed out from Hoplite, and he promptly fell flat on his back with a loud crash. His cheeks had turned a deep shade of red, and he looked up at Lance with a smile. Is this was, yeah, Hoplite said wisely. Lance nodded in satisfaction. Now Hoplite was well and properly drunk, and could communicate with Lance properly. You must stand up, Hops, Lance told him sagely, placing her hands on her knees as she leaned over him. Hoplite blinked in confusion a moment before nodding. Affirmative, Hoplite told her in a slurring monotone. When he finally rose to his feet, he let out a long sigh before asking, What's your shot? Pick me up, Lance said, lifting her arms towards him. After approximately 3 seconds, Hoplite complied, lifting Lance from the air like she weighed little more than a doll. For a brief instant, she remembered the rabbit he had brutalized in the forest, her blood freezing as Hoplite held her in his grasp. When he didn't eat her, she relaxed in his hands, letting out a sigh of relief. He held her at eye level with him for a moment before Lance remembered what it was she wanted him to do. Spin me, she ordered in a commanding tone. Spin me fast. Another 3 seconds. Then Hoplite nodded. The crowd surrounding them had hardly shifted since this interaction began, the onlookers clearly interested in what was about to transpire. The world was already spinning before Hoplite began swinging her around. Slowly at first, before he turned into a practical tornado. Lance laughed as he spun, maintaining his position before the table without even the slightest deviation. His gauntlets were cold beneath her arms, but the alcohol helped her simply not care. If they were surrounded by mattresses, Lance would have asked Hoplite to toss her into one, but maybe she would still die if he did that. Wait, there were no mattresses anyway. What was she thinking about? Oh yeah, she was about to puke. Okay, you can stop. Lance managed to get out, before Hoplite could receive a face full of bile. He slowed his spinning, blinking before promptly falling back to the dirt once again. He hadn't let go of Lance first, unfortunately, so she went with him. He managed to slow their mutual fall by catching the ground behind them with one hand, holding Lance aloft for a brief instant with his other hand. When it was all said and done, Lance found herself practically straddling his chest plate, both laughing like children. As a human, Hoplite really was basically a child to her. A little baby person. Or, yeah, a baby person. How old's am you? Lance asked, leaning over his face. Hoplite blew away the strands of her hair from his face as he thought. Lance suspected that he was at least in his 30s. Yes, much younger than her at 237. 238, Hoplite told her simply. Lance stared in shock at Hoplite. What? Lance whined as she slapped his chest plate. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you're new here, welcome aboard. Check out the description for the story and join the Discord if you like. Consider supporting the channel and the author as well. It's a dangerous world out there, but remember to be brave and look up to seek the stars.